From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump moves again to assert control over so-called independent federal agencies as Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. plans to disrupt an immunization advisory committee amid a measles outbreak in Texas that has now reached 90 cases and 16 hospitalizations, most of them children with no verified vaccination. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnists Alicia Finley and Kim Strassel. Washington these days is an alphabet soup of agencies from the SEC and the FCC to the FTC and the CFTC. Many of these are so-called independent agencies with directors, commissioners who can't be fired by the president except for cause under the law. President Trump is challenging that precedent across the board, and a new one came this week in an executive order titled Ensuring Accountability for All Agencies. Here's part of what it says. It says these regulatory agencies currently exercise substantial executive authority without sufficient accountability to the president and through him to the American people. Moreover, these regulatory agencies have been permitted to promulgate significant regulations without review by the president. So this order is now telling these independent agencies, so-called, to submit proposed and final regulations for White House review before they are published, with one significant exception. Alicia, what do you make of this, and how big a change is this to the way that much of the bureaucratic apparatus in Washington has operated?
So it is a major change in terms of these supposedly independent agencies, or as Trump says in his executive order, so-called independent agencies. So these agencies and their heads are not directly responsible to the president. As you mentioned, most of them cannot be removed from the president except for cause, meaning like misconduct or basically neglect of duties. You're not doing your job. The Supreme Court has actually pared that back a little bit, mostly recently in Seal Law, and then in the Collins case a year or two later involving the CFPB director and the FAH, the Federal Housing Finance Agency director. And these were heads of agencies that were relatively recently created, both of them around Dodd-Frank Act. I mean, these were independent agencies, but the Supreme Court there ruled that they actually exercised executive power, and therefore the president should be able to remove them at will. But nonetheless, these agencies and all the others do not have to submit rulemakings to the Office of Management Budget Office, or what's known as OIRA, to review further cost-benefit analysis, legal analysis, or the Justice Department actually assists with that. So they are independent to that extent. In recent years, I'd argue that they've actually become quite political. And so that what Trump is doing is just basically eliminating this pretense of them being independent agencies and forcing them to report to the president, which is, I think, what the Constitution's framers intended.
The theory when these agencies were set up, many of them in the Wilson or the FDR eras, that they'd be staffed by experts. They would have some significant power to regulate business or stocks or media in the case of the Federal Communications Commission. And so they should be insulated from politics. One challenge to that idea, as Alicia lays out, is whether that is the way that these agencies in recent years have actually operated. Another one, it seems to me, is that there are also broad, significant powers that are operated by agencies that are politically accountable. And think of the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, a cabinet agency answerable to the president. And if the FDA can go about, approving drugs and pulling drugs from the market in a relatively apolitical manner, as I think most people think that it has done, generally speaking, over the past several decades, it's not clear necessarily why an agency that is regulating the stock market or the media market or business broadly, antitrust law, for example, should be unable to do the same. And antitrust is actually an interesting example, Kim, because there are two agencies that do antitrust enforcement in the United States. One of them is a so-called independent agency, that is the Federal Trade Commission, and one of them is not, that is the Justice Department. Department. And when the FTC and the Justice Department disagree about who is going to take the lead on reviewing a merger, what they do is they literally flip a coin. And so if you are in a situation where whether this merger is being reviewed for antitrust concerns by a so-called independent agency or a non-independent agency, the Justice Department, which reports up through the Attorney General to the President in a democratically accountable manner, that is at the very least an odd situation and challenges the idea that the independence of these agencies is really the only way to go about this successfully.
Yeah, I think that brings up this question, Kyle, that division of power that you were mentioning. Why is it this way? I mean, why do we have that kind of confusion? Why do we have this alphabet soup of agencies? And you and Alicia were just talking about some of the problems there, that they're not really insulated from politics, et cetera. But you have to go back, Wilson, FDR, the Congresses back then created this in part because these are also their creatures, right? Their minions. You don't have to create these bodies independent of established cabinet and departments that are out there. As you noted, the FDA is part of Health and Human Services. They chose to do that because, in theory, by the way, a lot of these independent, or at least on paper, these independent agencies, they report to Congress. The president's hands are tied in many cases in terms of removing their directors. There's a lot of confusion, and there has been a lot of debate, for instance, about whether or not orders that the White House, executive orders that are put out, do they apply to these, quote, independent agencies or not? They're allowed to issue policies that in theory could be opposite to those of the executive that the American people elected. It's a real constitutional problem in my mind, especially given the fact that these days, a lot of these agencies, and I was doing a quick count, there are different kinds of them. For instance, a lot of people might be surprised to know that the EPA is actually an independent agency, although it is what we call an independent executive agency, and therefore is answerable in most form and fashion to the President of the United States. The CIA, by the way, is also an independent agency, but also in a similar situation. So they're not as big of a problem, but there's more than 100 of these overall. And some of these, and this is the issue, a lot of them, if you just look around Washington, arguably have far more power than even a lot of departments that have been created. And yet no real accountability, at least not in the way that the executive department heads do and other entities that the president takes responsibility for. So my issue with these is their quasi status. I looked in vain in the Constitution, couldn't find a single article that said, here's where we allow you to create random independent agencies.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
I agree with Kim that this is a constitutional problem. Article 2 of the Constitution, setting up the executive branch, says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. So that has been the argument behind this theory. On the other hand, Alicia, there is a lot of water under the bridge since the New Deal era when these agencies were set up. That is something that courts will consider. The Supreme Court will consider if these challenges to these independent agencies ultimately get there, so-called reliance interests. And one notable thing about this executive order from the president is that it exempts Federal Reserve monetary policy from having to go through the White House. Alicia, what do you make of that inclusion of this exemption? It doesn't exclude the Federal Reserve completely. If the Federal Reserve is doing a supervision, regulation of financial institutions, that, according to this executive order, is going to have to go through the White House like everything else, but not monetary policy.
Well, I think that was mainly owing to political expedience for the same reasons that Trump has not fired the Fed chairman Jay Powell yet, despite his dislike for him and his comments about him. He doesn't want to spook markets. And I think his advisors told him that, well, if you were to place a Fed monetary policy under the direct supervision of the White House, and with the Fed taking orders from the White House, you would see a lot of market ructions. And I don't think that that's something that Trump wanted to invite. Now, going back to your note about Article 2, instructing that the president, quote unquote, take care that the laws be faithfully executed. You had earlier mentioned the Federal Trade Commission and Justice Department, which are both in charge of enforcing antitrust laws. There are a lot of other examples of similar discrepancies between agencies. For instance, the Energy Department is in charge of regulating liquefied natural gas exports, and yet the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is an independent agency, is in charge of regulating the pipelines that connect to them. So sometimes you have one hand not speaking to the other hand and working at cross purposes, and believe it or not, a lot of these agencies can pursue litigation and make appeals without consulting the Justice Department. So in some cases, you have actually had the Justice Department weigh in on a different side than the actual agency. I think that happened once during Trump's first term between the SEC and the Justice Department. They may have different views of a law. And so this is not what the framers intended. Hamilton argued that, energy and the executive, you need to have a cohesive executive and presidency to enforce laws. Otherwise, the dispersal of power among various different agencies or consuls, as he would have said in the Roman times, really reduces accountability and creates chaos.
Kim, what's your read of these potential complications, thinking like a swing vote perhaps on the Supreme Court if it's Chief Justice John Roberts, maybe Amy Coney Barrett, maybe Justice Brett Kavanaugh? Not only the question of the Federal Reserve, but simply that some of these agencies exist in a way that, to my eye, looks like direct presidential control has the potential to break them as they are set up. So the Federal Election Commission, for example, is supposed to have no more than half its members from one party. But if a new president can come in and fire all of the commissioners he doesn't like from the other party, then it's not clear how some of these agencies are actually supposed to operate. And maybe one response to that is that Congress should get up off its duff if the Supreme Court, in fact, rules for energy the executive and amend or get rid of some of these agencies or lessen their power in a way that might be helpful.
Let's be clear. One outcome of this order, and look, everybody in the Trump administration understood this. In issuing this order, there was a recognition, a desire, I would argue, to take on this legal question and court lawsuits so that this is something that the Supreme Court has to address. Because the reality is the court has not wanted to address it. Some of the precedents upholding and rulings upholding these independent agencies stretch all the way back to the 1930s. As recently as a few years ago, the court was confronted with an element of this question that had to do with the Consumer Financial Protection Board and kind of danced around it because there's clearly a worry in the court. And I hope that this does not dissuade them from ruling on a constitutional basis on this question. But there's a worry that the kind of havoc that would come from all of this, sort of like what you were describing, will just be so immense that do we really want to go down that road? I think that's a very poor argument for coming up with a very poor legal decision to keep them in place. Look, these things can be handled. Congress created these things in the first place, and I don't think it's too much to ask Congress that if it is now told that it erred constitutionally in the way that these were created, that it recreate them in another form and fashion that is constitutionally permissible. Yes, there would be some real havoc in D.C. By the way, I think that's kind of fun. Like, we've been, on autopilot for a long time here. Let's rethink some of these. Now, there's a betting that the Supreme Court may not have the will to go there, but we will see. And these things can be handled and dealt with. And in fact, you can make the argument that having entities that are fully accountable to the president and therefore to the voters, even if they didn't have all the supposed bipartisanship structures that are in there, which, as we all know, don't really work that well anyway. But even if they didn't have that, you'd probably get better functioning Washington and agencies anyway.